Do you only pray when the pressure rises? When the news is bad? When fear starts to grow? When everything feels like it's slipping out of control? And once the crisis passes, does prayer move back to the background? You may have never noticed it before, but there is an invisible cost to living this way, a silent spiritual price that weakens your stability, erodes your inner authority, and keeps you constantly reacting instead of being prepared. In this video, we're going to uncover the hidden cost of praying only in times of crisis. You'll understand why prayer was never meant to be a fire extinguisher, but a way to build structure before the fire even starts. We'll look at clear biblical patterns that show how disciplined prayer forms strength, maturity, and emotional resilience, and why those who only pray in desperation remain spiritually vulnerable. If you feel like you live in a reactive spiritual cycle, always trying to recover after the impact, if you've noticed that your faith rises and falls with circumstances, or if you want to develop a stability that doesn't depend on the chaos around you, this video may permanently change how you see prayer. Stay until the end, because understanding this can transform not only your spiritual routine, but the way you face every crisis from this point forward. You've probably noticed this pattern in your own story, even if you've never given it a name. When everything is stable, when the bills are paid, when your health seems under control and your relationships are flowing, prayer becomes less urgent. Not necessarily absent, but less intentional, less prioritized. It stops being the foundation and becomes an addition. And that seems harmless, until the next wave of pressure arrives and exposes what was quietly neglected. In calm seasons, it's common to replace dependence with management. You organize your routine, solve your problems, make decisions, fulfill responsibilities, and little by little, prayer stops being the central axis and starts occupying leftover spaces in your day. It's not open rebellion, it's functional distraction. It's life happening without proportional spiritual vigilance. And that shift is subtle, almost imperceptible. In Judges 10:14, we see a clear portrait of this cycle. The people of Israel drifted while they were comfortable, immersed in distraction and self-sufficiency, until oppression arose. Then they cried out. They sought God intensely. They promised change. They received deliverance. But after restoration, the pattern repeated. Prosperity led to distraction. Distraction led to distance. Distance led to vulnerability. The crisis was not the beginning of the problem. It was simply the moment it became visible. Notice that in this passage, God confronts the pattern. He exposes the repetition, not because their cry was invalid, but because the absence of consistency revealed structural shallowness. The cry was sincere, but it was not sustained by prior discipline. This shows that momentary intensity does not replace continuous construction. This pattern doesn't belong only to Israel's history. It quietly repeats itself in the lives of many Christians today. Prayer activates when the pain increases. When fear threatens, when something slips out of control, intensity rises, but it's driven by emergency. This creates a reactive spirituality, where God is sought as a response to the problem, not as the permanent foundation of life. The central point here is not to criticize those who pray in crisis. Praying in crisis is necessary. The problem begins when crisis becomes the only trigger, when prayer is not part of daily structure, but only part of survival mode. This creates an unstable spiritual rhythm where faith rises in desperation and fades in stability, and this constant fluctuation prevents consistent maturity. There is also a more subtle aspect: silent self-sufficiency. In seasons of calm, it is easy to trust your own organization, your own strength, your own ability to manage life. It's not a conscious rejection of God. It's a gradual distancing, a relaxation of spiritual vigilance, a false sense that everything is under control. And this untested confidence creates invisible fragility. Over time, that fragility accumulates. The absence of consistent practice weakens sensitivity. The lack of continuous dialogue reduces discernment. Silent neglect diminishes inner resilience. None of this is noticed while everything seems to be working, but the internal structure is already being compromised. So the crisis does not create weakness. It reveals what was already weak. When pressure comes and your heart panics, it doesn't mean the crisis destroyed your faith. It means the structure was not being strengthened beforehand. The storm simply exposes the quality of the construction, and if prayer only happens under threat, the construction will always be shallow. This reactive pattern also affects your perception of God. If you only draw near in urgent moments, your relationship with Him becomes conditioned by problem and solution. That reduces the depth of communion. It turns relationship into an emergency resource, and over time, it shapes your spiritual mindset, leading you to associate prayer only with immediate relief. Ask yourself honestly, in seasons when everything is relatively calm, does your pursuit of God remain consistent? Or does it gradually decrease until something forces you back? Do you maintain discipline when there is no external pressure? Or does your spiritual intensity depend on the level of threat? This question is not meant to produce guilt, but awareness, because without awareness, the cycle remains invisible, and what is invisible is never corrected. A reactive spiritual pattern creates a dangerous rhythm. Comfort leads to relaxation, relaxation leads to distance, distance leads to vulnerability, vulnerability leads to crisis, crisis leads to intense crying out, and then it all starts again. As long as this cycle is not interrupted, you will always be reacting, never building. Always trying to recover after impact instead of being prepared before it. Interrupting this pattern begins with honest diagnosis. Not with emotional promises made under pressure, not with temporary intensity fueled by fear, but with clear recognition that the crisis is not the main problem. The problem is the absence of structure in the quiet days. And until that absence is confronted, the cycle will continue to repeat. And this is where an essential question arises. If prayer is not meant to be merely a response to chaos, then what is it really? Because as long as it is seen only as an emergency tool, you will keep repeating the pattern. To break this cycle, it is necessary to redefine the very meaning of prayer. And that requires changing how you see it in the days when everything seems fine. If prayer is not merely a response to crisis, then we must precisely redefine what it truly means. Because as long as it is seen as an emergency resource, you will continue to treat it like an emotional relief button, something pressed when fear rises. But Scripture presents something far deeper and more structural. In 1 Thessalonians 5:17 it says, "Pray without ceasing." This instruction does not speak of occasional intensity, but of continuous consistency. It's not about spiritual volume in critical moments. It's about a daily rhythm of dependence. Pray without ceasing does not mean living on your knees all day or repeating words automatically. It means maintaining a constant posture of spiritual awareness. It is living with your heart aligned, your mind adjusted, your sensitivity active. It is an internal state before it is an external act. It is an invisible discipline before it is a public expression. When you understand this, you realize that prayer is not activated by pressure. It is what sustains you before pressure comes. The problem with praying only in crisis is that prayer becomes episodic. It appears in emotional peaks, but disappears in ordinary routine. And what is episodic does not build lasting structure. Internal formation requires repetition. Just as muscles are strengthened through consistent training, spiritual stability is built through regular practice. Strength is not born in the moment of battle. It is developed in the invisible training no one sees. When Paul writes, "Pray without ceasing," He describes an integrated life where communion is not an isolated event, but part of identity. This completely shifts perspective. Prayer stops being a rescue tool and becomes a formation process. It shapes your thinking throughout the day. It adjusts your reactions. It corrects hidden motivations. It strengthens discernment. And all of this happens before the crisis, not during it. There is a clear difference between emergency contact and continuous relationship. Emergency contact seeks immediate solutions. Continuous relationship builds depth and trust. If you only seek God when you need intervention, your spirituality will be marked by urgency and relief, but not maturity. However, when prayer becomes part of daily structure, it begins to form invisible roots that sustain you in difficult seasons. These roots are developed through repetition. Small daily moments of alignment may seem insignificant, but they accumulate strength over time. A few minutes of consistent prayer every day produce more structure than long periods of isolated intensity. Discipline creates invisible stability, and that stability does not depend on emotion, it depends on construction. Many people confuse intensity with maturity. They assume that long prayers under pressure compensate for weeks or months of neglect. But intensity does not replace consistency. What transforms character is not occasional desperate crying out, but deliberate repeated practice. Spiritual formation happens in silent regularity. When prayer is constant, it begins adjusting your perception before the problem appears. It trains your mind to trust before fear rises. It trains your heart to remain steady before anxiety takes over. It trains your internal posture to respond with balance instead of reacting with panic. This training is invisible, but deeply real. It does not begin in emergency. It begins in what seems like ordinary routine. Consistency also develops sensitivity. When you maintain continuous dialogue with God, your perception becomes refined. You begin to discern your own motivations more clearly. You start noticing mental patterns before they become dominant. You identify distractions before they turn into distance. That level of perception does not come from occasional prayer. It comes from consistent practice. Perhaps you are realizing that you have always associated prayer with urgent need. Perhaps it has always been a response to problems, not a formative habit. But if the biblical instruction is consistency, then the purpose is construction. Daily prayer is not only to ask for something, it is to form something within you. So the question is not only, do you pray when you need something? The question is your prayer building something every day? Is it forming stability, strengthening discernment, shaping your character? Or is it limited to moments of pressure? Because if consistency does not exist, structure will not exist either. Redefining prayer is the first step out of the reactive cycle. When you understand that it is a formative discipline, you stop using it merely as a response to chaos. And as you change that definition, you begin to realize that the hidden cost of praying only in crisis is not merely emotional, it is structural. And if that structure is not built deliberately, future impacts will expose its absence. Many Christians don't realize that the first cost of praying only in crisis is not immediate. It is cumulative. You don't wake up one day and suddenly notice you've become spiritually unstable. It happens progressively, almost imperceptibly. Small daily neglects produce structural weaknesses that only surface under pressure. When prayer is not part of the consistent building of your life, your faith begins to depend excessively on external circumstances to remain steady. In Ephesians 4:14 it says that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about by every wind. The principle here is maturity. Spiritual immaturity produces emotional instability. When there is no consistent growth, any wind, criticism, unexpected news, any threat to your sense of control, has the power to shift you internally. The absence of consistency in prayer prevents maturation, And without maturation, faith fluctuates. Spiritual instability does not mean absence of faith. It means shallow faith. It is a faith that responds to pressure but does not sustain prolonged resistance. It reacts with momentary intensity but does not maintain steady firmness. When you pray only in crisis, your spiritual life starts functioning like an emergency system. And emergency systems are not designed to sustain daily life. They are designed to respond to extreme events. This creates a dangerous pattern. Peaks of intensity, followed by periods of relaxation. You pray fervently when you need to, but relax when the pressure decreases. That cycle prevents deep rooting, because deep roots are formed through consistency, not emotional impulse. Daily repetition strengthens the interior. Its absence keeps the surface fragile. Notice how your faith behaves when something unexpected happens. Is your first reaction trust or fear? Clarity or confusion? Peace or immediate anxiety? These responses reveal the level of prior construction. If prayer has been sporadic, your reaction tends to be disproportionate. If discipline has been consistent, there is more balance. The crisis does not create your reaction, it reveals your preparation. Instability also affects your thought process. Negative thoughts encounter less resistance. Pessimistic scenarios become dominant more easily. Anxiety escalates quickly because there has been no continuous strengthening of the mind. Daily prayer acts as a constant internal alignment. It trains your thinking to remain anchored before fear attempts to take control. There is a difference between feeling emotions and being governed by them. Emotions are natural. Instability happens when they become your direction. When spiritual structure is weak, emotions lead decisions. When there is consistency in prayer, emotions are acknowledged, but do not control your posture. This kind of inner government does not emerge in the moment of pressure. It is the result of accumulated practice. Another sign of spiritual instability is the constant need for external confirmation. You look for immediate signs that God is acting. You need to feel something strong, to believe He is present. But maturity learns to remain firm even when there are no intense sensations. That firmness is built in the quiet consistency of regular prayer. When prayer is limited to moments of desperation, your faith never develops enough depth to endure prolonged pressure. You may react well in short crises, but you begin to wear down when the problem lingers. The absence of prior discipline makes every challenge heavier than it should be. Perhaps you recognize this pattern in yourself. Seasons of strong spiritual intensity followed by long periods of neutrality. Firm decisions made under pressure that weaken over time. Promises made in prayer that lose strength once stability returns. This is not a lack of sincerity. It is a lack of continuous structure. If this content is bringing clarity to you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Here we focus on practical spiritual formation, maturity and structure, not just momentary inspiration. Spiritual growth requires consistency, and exposing yourself to this kind of teaching can be part of your decision to build before the next crisis. The truth is that spiritual instability is not corrected in the middle of the next storm. It is corrected in the discipline you develop before it. As long as prayer remains an emergency response, your faith will continue to fluctuate with the winds of circumstance. But when consistency begins, instability begins to lose its power. And as you understand this first cost, you start to realize it is not the only one. There is another silent effect that accompanies this lack of discipline, a gradual weakening of spiritual sensitivity, and that is what we need to address now. The second cost of praying only in crisis is less visible, yet even more dangerous. The gradual weakening of spiritual sensitivity. Unlike instability, which appears in your reactions, the loss of sensitivity happens internally, almost without noise. You continue living, continue believing, continue participating in spiritual environments, but something inside you becomes less perceptive. Hebrews 5:14 says that solid food is for the mature, who by constant practice have trained their senses to discern good and evil. Notice the phrase, by constant practice. Discernment is not automatic, it is developed. Spiritual sensitivity does not come from intense events, but from continuous practice. Without exercise, perception weakens. When prayer happens only in emergency, it produces intensity, but not training. You cry out with strength, but you do not exercise consistency. And without consistency, your ability to discern becomes shallow. It becomes harder to notice small distractions. Subtle deviations go unnoticed. Quiet thoughts gain space without immediate resistance. Spiritual sensitivity functions like a muscle. When you maintain continuous dialogue with God, your perception adjusts. You begin to identify internal inclinations before they become patterns. You recognize misguided motivations before they dominate decisions. You notice inner tensions before they turn into anxiety. This clarity is born from ongoing proximity, but when communication is sporadic, that perception decreases. You don't lose your faith, you lose sharpness. You start confusing emotional impulses with spiritual direction. You interpret anxiety as divine urgency. You react to internal sensations without examining them deeply. Lack of exercise reduces precision. Another effect of weakened sensitivity is difficulty hearing direction in calm seasons. If you only seek God when something is wrong, your mind associates prayer with problems. On ordinary days, your listening becomes less active. Perception becomes reactive. That limits growth because spiritual maturity requires awareness before crisis, not only during it. There is also the risk of normalizing small distances. When prayer is not consistent, you adapt to lower levels of spiritual awareness. You begin accepting distractions as inevitable. You justify relaxation as a normal phase. Gradually, what once disturbed you no longer does. And this desensitization is dangerous. Discernment is not only about knowing right from wrong morally. It is about perceiving direction, timing, and necessary internal adjustments. This capacity is refined through consistency. Without discipline, your reading of situations becomes less precise. You respond more from impulse than from built clarity. Think about how you perceive your own motivations. Can you identify when you are acting out of fear, when you are seeking approval, when insecurity is guiding your decisions? That kind of self-awareness requires trained sensitivity, and that training happens in consistent prayer where your mind is regularly realigned. When prayer is limited to crisis, you may experience deep moments, but you do not develop perceptive consistency. Intensity does not replace refinement. Emotion does not replace discernment. The silent repetition of daily communion is what sharpens your perception. This weakening is silent because it does not produce immediate collapse. It produces gradual confusion. You begin to struggle distinguishing anxiety from conviction, impulse from direction, fear from prudence. And that confusion makes your decisions increasingly unstable over time. Understand that this is not accusation, it is diagnosis. If your sensitivity seems lower than before, it may not be lack of faith, it may be lack of consistent exercise. Disciplined prayer keeps your spiritual faculties trained. Without training, discernment loses precision. And as you understand this cost, you begin to see that praying only in crisis not only makes you unstable, it makes you less perceptive. And when perception weakens, authority begins to weaken as well, because spiritual authority depends on consistent alignment. And that is what we need to talk about next. The third cost of praying only in crisis is the gradual loss of inner authority. And this is a silent loss, because spiritual authority does not appear publicly first, it manifests within. It is revealed in the firmness of your decisions, in emotional stability under pressure, in the ability to govern your thoughts before they govern you. When prayer is not consistent, that authority begins to weaken almost imperceptibly. James 4:7 declares, "Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you." Notice the order carefully. Submission comes before resistance. Authority is not born in direct confrontation. It is born in daily surrender. If submission only happens once the problem is already present, resistance will be unstable. Because spiritual authority is not activated at the moment of threat, it is built through discipline before the threat appears. When you pray only under pressure, your spiritual posture becomes reactive. You try to resist fear, anxiety, temptation, or confusion without having previously strengthened your internal structure. It is like entering a battle without consistent training. The intention may be sincere, but the preparation is insufficient, and sincerity does not replace preparation. Inner authority is the result of self-governance. It is the ability to direct your thoughts, control impulses, regulate emotions, and align decisions with deep convictions. This kind of governance does not arise spontaneously. It is trained through the consistency of daily prayer. Every moment of alignment strengthens your ability to remain firm when pressure increases. Without continuous discipline, resistance becomes emotional. You try to overcome feelings with momentary effort. You attempt to compensate for weeks of neglect with temporary intensity, but intensity does not replace formation. Spiritual authority is built in the repeated silence of routine, not only in the dramatic confrontation of crisis. Another effect of losing inner authority is difficulty establishing clear internal boundaries. Negative thoughts gain space more easily. Disordered impulses become harder to interrupt. Impulsive reactions increase. Small compromises begin to accumulate. This does not mean absence of faith. It means lack of structural strengthening. Consistency in prayer strengthens your ability to say no internally before the problem grows externally. When submission is daily, you develop progressive clarity. You learn to recognize what must be accepted and what must be rejected. You learn to discern which thoughts to nurture and which to interrupt immediately. You learn not to react automatically to every external stimulus. This kind of stability is not natural. It is cultivated. It is the fruit of repeated and intentional practice. There is also an important aspect. Inner authority reduces emotional vulnerability. When you are spiritually aligned consistently, unexpected situations do not have the same power to destabilize your mind. You may feel impact, but you do not collapse. You may experience pressure, but you do not lose direction. That is the result of prior construction. If you notice that your decisions fluctuate as pressure increases, perhaps the problem is not only the intensity of the crisis, but the absence of prior building. Spiritual authority is not the volume of prayer under stress. It is consistent alignment that strengthens your posture before the threat. It is repeated discipline that forms silent resistance. If this teaching is helping you see your spiritual life more clearly, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Here we do not focus only on emotional moments or quick solutions. We talk about structural formation, consistent maturity, and the development of real inner authority. Growth requires consistency, and consistency requires decision. When prayer becomes part of your routine, your resistance stops being fragile. You do not fight with desperation, you respond with stability. Your authority is not loud, but it is firm. And that firmness is not created in crisis, it is revealed in crisis. And as you recognize the loss of inner authority, you begin to understand something essential. The next wave of pressure will not be the moment to build something new. It will be the moment to reveal what has already been built in silence. And that is exactly what we need to examine now. When the crisis finally arrives, it does not create your spiritual condition, it reveals it. This is a point many avoid facing, because it is more comfortable to believe that the pressure was too strong than to acknowledge that preparation was insufficient. But crisis functions as a structural test. It exposes what was built in the quiet days. In Matthew 26:40-41, in Gethsemane, Jesus finds his disciples sleeping while he is praying. He says, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Notice that the moment of vigilance was supposed to happen before the temptation. Prayer there was not a reaction to failure, it was prevention against it. The lack of preparation preceded the fall. The disciples were not unbelievers. They had conviction, intention, emotional willingness, but they lacked sufficient discipline in that moment. The crisis revealed what had not been strengthened beforehand. When the pressure increased, fragility surfaced. This shows that good intention does not replace spiritual preparation. When you face a crisis and notice disproportionate anxiety, intense confusion, or difficulty maintaining clarity, it does not mean you lost your faith in that instant. It means the structure was not consolidated beforehand. The crisis simply accelerates exposure. It reveals where the gaps exist. Many people try to build while under impact. They attempt to develop discipline in the middle of chaos. They try to establish consistency when fear is already active. That is possible to a certain extent, but it is far more difficult because crisis consumes emotional energy that could have been preserved through prior preparation. Preventive prayer functions as anticipatory strengthening. It adjusts your mind before temptation appears. It fortifies your heart before fear tries to dominate. It creates clarity before confusion settles in. When this practice does not exist, every crisis feels heavier than it should. It is also important to understand that crisis is not the enemy. It is revealing. It shows the real level of your construction. And that should not produce guilt, but strategic awareness, because you can only strengthen what has been identified as fragile. If you frequently come out of crises spiritually exhausted, perhaps the issue is not only the intensity of what you face, but the absence of prior structure. When prayer is consistent, crisis still hurts, but it does not destroy. It still pressures, but it does not dismantle. It still challenges, but it does not disorient. Gethsemane teaches something profound. Watching and praying before temptation is more effective than trying to resist after it has already dominated your internal environment. Vigilance does not begin when the problem appears. It begins in disciplined routine, and that difference changes everything. When the next wave of pressure comes, and it will come, it will reveal whether you live reacting or building. It will reveal whether your faith is episodic or structured. It will reveal whether your inner authority has been developed or merely activated temporarily. And that is precisely why we need to look at the preventive model, because if crisis reveals, then construction must happen beforehand. And there is a clear pattern that shows how this building is done in a practical and consistent way. If crisis reveals what has been built, then the most important question is not how to react better in the next problem, but how to build before it happens. And here we find a clear model in Scripture. In Luke 5:16 it says that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Notice that the text does not say he prayed only under threat. It says he did it frequently. It was a pattern. It was part of his identity. Jesus did not need to wait for a crisis to seek the Father. His discipline was not driven by desperation, but by consistency. He built before pressure. He strengthened himself before the crowds. He aligned his heart before difficult decisions. This reveals that prayer is not merely a spiritual reaction, it is continuous formation. Preventive building begins with small, repeated decisions. It does not have to be long or dramatic. It needs to be consistent. A fixed time, a reserved moment, a protected space. When you establish discipline in ordinary days, you are investing in stability for difficult days. It is a strategic decision, not an emotional one. Many people wait to feel motivated to pray. But building does not depend on emotion. It depends on commitment. When prayer becomes part of your routine, it stops being optional and becomes foundational. You do not pray because you are in crisis. You pray because it is part of your spiritual identity. Another powerful example is Daniel 6:10. Even knowing the imminent threat, Daniel maintained his pattern of praying 3 times a day. He did not create discipline in the crisis. He maintained the discipline that already existed. This shows that prior consistency sustains future firmness. Daniel's stability was not born in the lion's den. It was built long before. Building before the storm means developing a rhythm. It means training your mind to return to alignment every day. It means strengthening your sensitivity, your authority, and your stability when nothing appears to be wrong. That is the difference between reacting and building. If this content has helped you see prayer in a more mature and strategic way, subscribe to the channel now. Here, we do not focus only on intense moments, but on practical formation, discipline, and continuous growth. Spiritual maturity is built step by step. Preventive construction also involves simplicity. It does not need to be complex. A daily commitment, even if brief, made with intentionality. What matters is not the initial length, but the regularity. Small practices accumulate invisible strength, and that strength manifests when pressure increases. Praying when everything is going well is an act of wisdom. It declares that your dependence is not conditioned by pain. It builds depth while the environment is calm. It strengthens roots when the ground is not shaking. The choice before you is clear. Continue reacting or begin building. Continue intensifying only when something goes wrong, or establish discipline before the next crisis arrives. The decision is not emotional, it is strategic. And that decision leads to an unavoidable conclusion. The hidden cost of praying only in crisis is structural. But the solution is also structural. And now we must consolidate all of this into a practical and conscious choice. Throughout this video, it has become clear that the hidden cost of praying only in crisis is not merely emotional, it is structural. It weakens your stability, reduces your sensitivity, and compromises your inner authority. It keeps you reacting when you should be building. And as long as this pattern continues, every new pressure will seem greater than it truly is. Colossians 4:2 says, "Devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful." Devotion implies continuity. It implies sustained decision, not momentary impulse. The vigilance mentioned in the text does not occur only when something is wrong. It is part of the constant posture of someone who understands that structure is built before the storm. The truth is simple. The next crisis will reveal what you are building today. It will not reveal how intense you were yesterday under pressure, but how consistent you were in silence. It will not reveal how desperately you cried out, but how faithfully you cultivated discipline in ordinary days. Praying only in crisis keeps you vulnerable. Praying consistently builds stability. The difference between reacting and remaining firm is not the intensity of the problem, but the depth of prior structure. And that structure does not arise by accident. It is the fruit of repeated decision. Perhaps you are realizing that you need to adjust your spiritual routine, not with guilt, not with emotional promises made under impact, but with a strategic decision. If maturity is built through repetition, then change begins with simple daily practice. If this video has brought clarity to you, subscribe to the channel now. Here you will find consistent teaching, practical direction, and structured growth, not just momentary inspiration. If you want to develop real maturity and spiritual consistency, this is a place for that. Now, before we close, turn this understanding into concrete action. Choose a fixed daily time to pray, even if it is just a few minutes, even if it seems simple. What matters is consistency. Do not wait for the next crisis to decide to seek depth. This silent choice made today is the beginning of a different structure. It is the start of a faith that does not depend on chaos to be activated. It is the step that transforms a reactive spirituality into a structured one. The decision is before you. Continue reacting or begin building. And what you build in silence will determine how you stand in the next storm.